That was my seat, yes. It's cool. Go ahead.
Right, welcome everybody to the Platypus convention. My name is Ben Campbell. I'm with the Platypus Affiliate Society. As you probably know, Platypus is a project that solves self-education and ultimately practical reconstitution of the Marxist left. We organize reading groups both for research and journalism, focus on the problems and tasks inherited by the old, new, and post-political left, and the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. This session of this workshop is part of a perspective series in which we invite our guests to the convention to present about their respective projects, be they parties, journal projects, tendencies, or whatnot. The featured guest for this workshop is Roger Rashi from Québec solidaire. Roger Rashi is a founding member of Québec solidaire, the political party. He sits on the steering committee of the Riding Université, which first elected Amir Kadir to the Quebec National Assembly in December 2008. Re-elected him with a larger majority in 2012. The party, formed in 2006, currently holds 2 seats in the Quebec legislature. Rashi was a member of Quebec Solidaire's Working Commission on the Environment in 2007 to 2012, and recently helped found the Réseau Éco-Socialiste, an eco-socialist network of Quebec activists. They'll be featured on the Saturday panel, Capital, History, and Environmental Politics, as well as on our closing plenary. So now I'm going to hand over to Roger for his remarks on Quebec solidaire, after which we'll have a Q&A, actually some sort of an open discussion. Roger.
Hi, thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to thank, obviously, the Platypus Conference for inviting me. The topic of this conference is tremendously interesting. Utopian program, Utopia. We'll have a chance to obviously discuss that in more depth and have a chance to air my views on this issue. So of course, when I talk about my party, Quebec Solidaire, it will be with the view of integrating the overall theme of this conference. What I'm going to try and do is show that the party that we've built in Quebec, its activity, its practice, does not necessarily answer all the questions that have to do with utopia and program, and particularly the perspectives for the left in the 21st century. But I think it has a contribution to it. It has some experiences, and it has some, if you want, insight into the tactics and strategy of building the left in the 21st century. So, what is my party? I'll just give you a basic few facts, and after that I'll put it in context, and we'll see a little bit what kind of strategy, what kind of tactics my party is. So our party was founded in 2006 as a united front, a political united front against neoliberalism. The party combines both a social platform, a platform that aims to go beyond capitalism, and also support for Quebec independence. What we've tried to do is link both issues, the social program and the national program, into one. And as of 2009, 2010, in various conventions, we've deepened our program and we adopted very strong anti-capitalist aspects of the program, going beyond the system, developing democratic planning, participatory democracy, and worker self-management in the main industry and the big financial sector. So, where do we stand today? When we formed the party in 2006, we had about 6,000 members. Today we stand at 14,000. We have run in 3 election campaigns in Quebec, 2007, 2008, and just now September 2012. In our first election campaign, we got about 3% of the vote. In our second election campaign, we got about 4% of the vote across Quebec, and we elected one member to the Quebec legislature of the National Assembly, the riding that I come from, Amir Kadir, who's a physician actually, a well-known anti-imperialist activist in Quebec, of Iranian origin, who was elected in our riding actually with a 700 or 800 vote majority. In the last election, he was re-elected with a 7,000 vote majority. And we had a second person elected just in the riding north, called Quebec. It's the second spokesperson for the party, François David, a woman well known as one of the leaders of the movement in Quebec, was just elected in the second round. What is our attitude towards elections, and why do we run elections? When we formed the party, we defined our essential strategic and tactical goal as being to combine the ballot box and the street. In other words, run an election, but at the same time help to develop and support the mass movements. We've tried to do both. It's not easy doing both, but we decided to do both for one very important reason. We felt that as of 1999, as of the end of the 20th century, with the Seattle movement, with mobilization in Seattle, like it's a world trade organization, a new wave of struggles were starting, not only in North America, but also in Europe and in Latin America. Essentially what we can call struggles against neoliberalism, against the right or the conservative right or conservative economics. And we felt that these mass struggles were the key struggles out of which new perspectives would emerge for the left and eventually a political left. Very quickly, we found out that the political perspective, the will, the wish to set up a political organization was lacking in many of the movements and in many of the people participating in the movements. So very early, as of 2000, 2001, we've tried to unite as many activists around the idea of forming a party that would be an expression of the social movements, but at the same time would run in elections as a way of concretizing at the political level, at the institutional level, the fight against neoliberalism, and use that as a further lever to develop the mass movements. That's what we call the strategy of the ballot box and the street. We have tried to run campaigns in a different style than the mainstream campaigns, which means that we have tried to revive the main aspect, the main tenets of what would be a militant, socialist, working class organization, even though we don't define ourselves as such. We try and bring in activists from the various movements, whether it's a women's movement, student movement, workers' movement, or the global justice movement. We develop large chapters in various ridings, in various neighborhoods in Montreal and across the province, and define collectively the strategy and the tactics locally, apply the programs locally, and as much as possible, we try and run activists from the area, people who have been active in the workers' movement, labor movement, student movement, etc. None of our members are well-known politicians. Our party was not set up as a splinter party from any of the mainstream parties. It was drawn from activists coming from the various social movements. Now, what does it mean in terms of composition? We've been very lucky in a certain sense. We've had a large number of young people under 35 join our party quite early. So we have a membership which is, I would say, anywhere from 30 to 40% below the age of 35. Since we've had several active, very radical social movements in Quebec, particularly the student strike in 2005 and the student strike last year in 2012, a tremendous amount of young activists have joined our party, either after the 2005 strike or are joining it right now after the 2000 strike. And each new wave, each new generation of young activists joining the party helped push the party platform forward and the party's activities. It's not for nothing. Yeah? It's not just by pure chance that our party adopted more anti-capitalist aspects, if you want, in our platform in 2008, 2009. This was a byproduct of activists from the student movement coming into the party after their strike in 2005 and pushing the party further to the left and consolidating the party on more anti-capitalist line. Now, after the strike of last year, as more and more leaders of that strike join our party, I think we will see a further radicalization of our platform over the next few months, at least in my opinion. So we see that our party also evolves as the social movements evolve in Quebec and reflects up to a point the developments of the social movements. So that brings me to the issue of how do we define social movements and why is it so important in the makeup and the functioning of our party. Now, I thought that it was, if you want, a normal part of setting up left-wing parties to work very closely with the social movements, but in discussion with activists from Toronto about a year ago, they remarked that our strategy seemed to be fairly close to that of the Latin American left in terms of the insistence put on social movements. And it got me thinking that maybe we should reflect and explain that aspect a little bit more. What helped create the conditions for setting up Quebec Solidaire was the developments of social movements from 1999 on. But I have to give you an idea of what the social movements are made up in Quebec and how politics of local questions play in the social movements. And I'll do that very quickly so you understand a little bit where we come from and what we're trying to do in Quebec. The main social movement in Quebec is a trade union. About 40% of the Quebec labor force is unionized. I believe it's the highest density of trade union organizing anywhere in North America. I think it's I don't think there's any other jurisdiction that has such a high number of workers unionized. One of the reasons is that the Quebec trade unions became very radical in the late 60s and late 70s. As in the early 70s, Quebec trade unions adopted a quasi-socialist program, calling for the end of capitalism, calling for defeating the regime, developing an independent and socialist Quebec. For many of them, this was only verbiage because the Quebec movements were very, particularly the youth movement was very active in Quebec and very revolutionary. But it did create the condition for a particularly militant trade union movement towards the late 70s. By the end of the 70s, Quebec had the highest per capita number of strikes of anywhere in the world. There were two labor movements at the time that were competing for being the most radical involved in the longest of most militant strikes. One was Italy, that was the late 70s, and the other one was Quebec. Frequent strike, long strike, violent strike, extreme militant strike, because at the time there was no anti-strike breaking legislation. That was brought in later on. So strikes and picket lines were defended physically against company-hired goons, and that created mass movements, generally support. Plus, there were two general strikes that were held in Quebec. One in the public sector in 1972, and the leaders of the three main unions were thrown in jail for contempt of court for some months after the strike, and the second one was in 1976. So you had mass movement, particularly strong in the labor movement, a radicalized labor movement, and that radical trajectory in the 70s kept the labor movement alive, and numerically it remains quite strong today, even though it's on the defensive. But even if it's on the defensive, it's capable of some radical action. For example, in 2004, in response to several anti-labor laws, labor movement shut down the Montreal port and shut down public transport for 24 hours. So it's still capable of large mobilization, large demonstration, but generally some defense. So the main social movements remain very important. Secondly, we have a very militant student movement going back to the late 60s again. There's been 8 general strikes of Quebec students since the late 60s. The last one was in 2012. And in fact, last year it launched what is in my experience, and I've been an activist for 4 years, what is in my experience the most radical movement, the most mass movement, the most massive rebellion, if you want, against the regime that I've seen in 40 years. What started as a student strike in February 2012, by June 2012, developed into a huge mass movement with 4 major demonstrations, each with 250,000 and more people marching in the street. And at the end, after the Quebec government brought in legislation to outlaw strikes, They had massive movement of civil disobedience with spontaneous demonstrations exploding in various areas of Montreal in total disregard for the law, and eventually forced the government to call election. The government was defeated by it. So we've seen a tremendous militancy among students, and student issues morphed very quickly into a general fight against austerity. What started as a movement against tuition hike ended up as a movement attacking the government's austerity measure on a wide number of issues. So the student movement has this capacity in Quebec because language and culture is such a key issue. We're small people, we're 8 million people in North America, in a continent which is vastly English-speaking, and just a small island of Quebec is French-speaking. So this minority status in North America makes anything that deals with language and culture a very key explosive issue. And free education, including free tuition at university level, has been a historic demand in Quebec since 1965. So when the government moves to increase tuition, even though tuitions are kept quite low in Quebec, even with the increase, they're around $2,500 per year, which is nothing compared to high tuition levels paid here. But when you start from the perspective that free university education is a key element of maintaining French language alive in Quebec, to the point where you start increasing tuition level, of course it becomes a key issue in terms of mobilizing not only students but eventually massive population. So we had a very militant student movement. Also the women's movement, as of the mid-90s, adopted as its main strategy the fight against poverty, saying that poverty affected a disproportionate number of women, and therefore the main brunt of the women's movement in Quebec, organized around the Federation of Quebec Women, has been to mobilize working class and poor women to fight for welfare and maintaining, the various welfare laws that continue to count. Also, the global justice movement has been very active and militant in Quebec ever since 1999. Just to give you an example, there was a World Social Forum in Asia just held last week. Quebec had about 200 people, 200 activists from Quebec participating in that thing, and there were 40 or 50 people that came from the labor movement, about 15 from the student movement, the youth movement. So there's a general tradition of participating in the World Social Forum and mobilizing on international issues which are very likely. So all these movements create a condition for having a political party such as ours and having or needing some form of political expression. And that is the main issue that we've been harping on in Quebec for the past 15 years, the need for the social movement to have their own autonomous form of political expression, as opposed to any mainstream party. Which are the mainstream parties that we fight against? Of course, the main right-wing party is called the Liberal Party in Quebec. Despite the fact that it's called the Liberal Party, basically it's a right-wing party, neoliberal, pro-business. And this is a party that was defeated in the elections held in 2012. The other mainstream party is a nationalist party called Parti Québécois, which has been advocating Quebec independence or sovereignty, basically what we did that through the years. That party was set up in 1968, and for many years was the main party through which French-speaking Quebecers expressed themselves. The trade union leadership has been in close alliance with the Parti Québécois for maybe 25 years. And most of the leadership of the social movements essentially hearken and look to the Parti Québécois as a way of expressing or defending their interests. So our key battle has been to break away the social movements and activists from the Parti Québécois. In a certain sense, the Parti Québécois acts like a social democratic party, like the New Democratic Party in English Canada, or the Socialist Party in Greece, or the Socialist Party in France. In other words, a party which claims to be to the left, but essentially applies neoliberal policies with the human face. That has been essentially the same policy in Quebec with the Parti Québécois. So breaking with the PQ, as we call it, has been a key aspect of our work and continues to be a key aspect of our work. And that brings me to the challenges that we face today. So having explained where we come from, the social movements, having explained what we're trying to do, develop a program of fighting against neoliberalism at the political level, having explained that we have developed that program into an anti-capitalist program, or elements of anti-capitalist program. What are the main strategic issues? What are the main strategic battles that we face over the next few years? There are two key ones. One comes straight out of the student movement class. Because of our history, the social movements, even though they've been tied in a certain way to mainstream parties, this tie is not what we can call an organic tie. In other words, it's not something which is voted upon and organically decided. It's usually deals which are struck just before election times. Overall, the social movements claim to be apolitical, non-partisan. But in fact, part of their leadership works with the Parti Québécois. So one important issue that we face, and tied in the student movement, is how do we bring social movements to support a party such as ours. Let's take the example of the student movement. The most radical part of the student movement is called SAIC. It's set up as a students' trade union. And from their inception in 2001, one of the key aspects of the program has been the fact that they support no political party and do not engage in election. Now, this was done essentially defensively in opposition to two other groups, the University Student Association and the College Student Association, which were, if not controlled, at least quite close to the Parti Québécois and engaged more in lobbying activity than mass mobilization. But now that there's a party such as ours in Quebec, the relationship between our party and the more radical student union is extremely difficult and fraught with contradictions. For example, by the month of June last year, when the government said that they were going to call elections because the issue of forcing the students back to school could not be decided by legal means, and only an election could develop the legitimacy to call an end to the strike, the student movement could not decide what their position would be on elections. So the attitude taken was essentially to say, election or no election, let's continue mobilizing. Except it's extremely hard to mobilize students in the month of July, August, when full summer is out, school is out. And also, whether you say so or not, 99% of the students knew that the elections were key because it was absolutely crucially important to defeat the party in power. So even though this was the policy adopted officially by the most radical part of the student, in fact, many students participated in election and also participated in the election campaign. After the elections happened and the party in power, the Liberal Party, was defeated, and the Parti Québécois, the Nationalist Party, came in with only minority. Again, the student union, the more radical part, said, we will continue the struggle just as we did before, and we'll defeat that government if they continue to attack us. Now the problem is that the political and ideological situation has radically shifted, even among the ranks of students. The Parti Québécois adopted as its tactic not a fee hike, but indexing the tuition fees, which is in fact is building in the principle of increase year by year. If not a major increase of 75%, it's a 2 or 3% increase. The more radical student group tried to mobilize and launch a strike call, and it fell completely upon dead ears. And in my discussion with them last week, they realized that you cannot mobilize in the same way against a so-called reformist party as you do against an open right-wing party. It just doesn't work. And to claim that it's the same thing doesn't work. To claim that politics has no importance doesn't work. To claim that elections don't make a difference doesn't work, because they do. So the question is, what do you do in a situation like that? Part of the Soon movement is anti-authoritarian, anti-election by principle. Part of it is sympathetic to us. Part of it is sympathetic to the Parti Québécois. So the whole issue over the next year will be a discussion with the students on the question of what do you do at the political level. Yes, you mobilize. Yes, you organize strikes. Yes, you try and defeat a government. But once you defeat that government, who do you propose? Who do you put forward? What kind of program do you seek to have in a party? How do you get involved in a party, and do you make sure that this party doesn't drift to the right? And so on and so forth. So, out of their own experience, I would say masses of young activists are coming to the conclusion, gradually but surely, that you cannot adopt in principle an anti-political attitude. That you have moments where you can mobilize the masses, but moments where the fight moves on to different terrains. And how you mix those different terrains, how you combine the more political aspect of the struggle, the mass mobilization struggle, how do you vary your tactics and you keep moving forward, is an issue that we have to confront, and we're confronting now. And it's an extremely important issue because, in a way, you find it in most of the social movements in Quebec. Same thing with the trade unions. They find it very difficult to break with a party in power, but at the same time, they don't like its policies. They cannot officially support our party, but yet they do work with our party. So you have this very uneasy situation which is developing, which is forcing our party, one, to clarify its program, two, to also find ways to make our program relevant to the more militant sections in the various social movements, so they join our party and at the same time continue maintaining it to the left. So one issue is, how do you combine being a mass movement activist and a political activist in the 21st century, when the legitimacy of the traditional parties of the left is no longer what it was 20 or 30 years ago. So that's one big issue. And if you have any questions or ideas on that, I'd love to discuss it with you. I think it ties in with the main theme of this conference. The second one is, what kind of tactics do you adopt at the electoral level? And how do you make sure that you do not reproduce the errors of the mainstream social democratic parties, which are essentially parliamentary parties? And that's a very difficult issue, and we're just beginning to wrestle. What happens, we realize, and I realize because I'm working very closely with the first elected member of parliament for my party, it's in my writing. I'm on the steering committee and a spokesperson for the chapter of Quebec Solidaire Mercier, so I have to deal quite often with Amir Kadir, who's in parliament. What I realized very quickly is that the pressure put on any parliamentarian of the left in the 21st century, if you're trying to be of the left, is incredible. The pressure to conform, to join, the campaigns which are launched against you by the right-wing medias is tremendous. Just to give you an example, over the past 2 years, Amir, who comes from a left-wing family, originally in Iran, which his parents were involved with the Iranian Communist Party, so they're anti-Khomeini forever. He's been accused of being an Islamic fundamentalist, a hidden Al-Qaeda in Quebec, and generally promoting women being veiled and other stupidities. I mean, systematic attacks in the right-wing press, I can say. During the student strikes last year, since he participated in every major demonstration, he was arrested one night in Quebec, just as the negotiations with the student leaders were breaking down. They came out of the government building in Quebec City, and he was there to meet them with several hundred students. The government arrested all the student negotiators and arrested him, threw him in jail overnight. Next morning was a huge campaign in Quebec. Amir Kadir arrested, shame on this parliamentarian. There was a call for him to resign or be thrown out of parliament. The week after that, the police swept into his house at 6 o'clock in the morning, arrested his daughter, and had her handcuffed and thrown in jail. She was a student activist who was involved in some direct action during the strike. She was arrested along with other activists and confined to her house. And for no apparent reason at all, she had just received the police 2 days before the police swept in. They decided to raise his house at 6 o'clock in the morning with full media, TV, right there to record the fact that American daughter was being arrested and thrown in jail. She spent 5 days in jail. Because it just happened before the weekend, just which a long weekend. And these things continue. And I could see him by the end of the parliamentary season, as the summer was coming last year, just being completely drained. Just could not handle all the attacks, all the continual attacks. The attacks in Parliament was alone, the attacks by the press, the attacks on the family. And I wouldn't say he had a breakdown, but I could see that he was rethinking seriously what he's doing. And I had long discussion with him, and he says, look, I can't continue. I cannot continue being alone in Parliament, up with 124 reactionaries attacking me. Just can't. I need to have 5 or 6 or 10 more people elected. Great, love to have 5 or 6 or 10 more people elected with you, but it ain't so easy. So out of that, he formulated an idea, and I'm coming to the question of tactics, of trying to arrive at some kind of an electoral compromise with the party committee, the Nationalist Party, the other mainstream party, the one that has an appearance of reformism, as a shortcut, as a way of developing as quickly as possible some kind of a parliamentary process. And we had a very spirited discussion and a very strong disagreement on this issue, because I said, look, you can't tread on your principles, you can't throw out the attacks and the critique that we've made for 15 years of that party. You can't deny the fact that we know that once they're in power that they'll betray every one of the promises, because somehow we want to hasten history and end up with 5 or 6 or 7 people elected. You cannot do that. So he did not come to this kind of position out of being dishonest or out of seeking a career. I mean, the first thing he told me, he said, look, I'd love to go back and be doctor. He's a doctor, you know? And he defines himself essentially as an activist and a doctor. He said, look, I can't stay out of medicine for 10 years, 15 years. I've got to stay in medicine regularly. Every 2 weeks he spends 2 days in hospital. No matter what he has to do, he spends in hospital going through, seeing his patient, continuing to be a physician. He says, I can't see myself as a professional politician. I can't stand it, and I won't do it for more than another term, maybe. So it's just to give you an idea that once you engage in politics, there's a kind of pressure brought by the system, by the mainstream party, by the parliamentary institutions, by the very act of being in parliament, which sometimes can break down the most determined of actors. So how do you organize inside to prevent that and still use elections as a lever to move forward left-wing ideas? I think it's a very difficult issue, but the only way you can do it is partially through the education side, on the need to continuously combine the ballot box and the street, but also on developing institutional means within your party to control the parliamentary function. And that we're sadly lacking. We don't know exactly how to do it. And one of the interesting discussions that I'm looking forward to having is with a comment from Greece, from Syriza. From what I understand, they have 67 elected parliamentarians. Now, that's one hell of a group. How do you maintain control of 60 or 70 parliamentarians? How do you make sure that not only they're disciplined, but they continue supporting the party line, that as various campaigns open up, as approaches are made by other parties, as all kinds of deals can be more or less drafted in Parliament, that you remain true to your program and true to your rules? How do you do this? How do you organize it? This is one thing which I'd like to hear from the comments in Greece, because I think they're on the cusp of this issue, and it's a lot more complicated dealing with 70 parliamentarians than only 2. You know? But I think this is one thing and a question that we have to put, which is extremely important. The other thing is, and linked to the question of elections, what kind of tactics, what kind of united front can you develop outside? And it's an issue on which most of the left-wing parties in Europe have floundered, the new left. They have either adopted an attitude of complete rejection of the Social Democratic Party and eventually failed, or an attitude of uniting with them and also getting into a dead end. How do you develop means of allying with those who support this party, working class voters, you know, and attract them to your party, can you unite with them? What issues, or do you, in principle, reject all these forms of unity? I think this is a very complex issue for the new left-wing party, and we're just beginning to deal with it in Quebec Solidaire. We're going to have to deal with it in the next few years. In fact, we have a convention in 2 weeks where this issue is going to be discussed at depth, and we are trying to deal, but I think this is one very important issue which is confronting the new left parties. So I'll stop it here, and I'll let...
Yeah, maybe that's a good time to open up to some Q&A. I think I'll start off with something I've been thinking about a little bit recently, reading some of your work. I want to ask you about the concurrent trajectories of the Canadian versus Quebec left. The way that you present it is almost like this is a first for the Quebec left. In fact, that, I mean, you call the Parti Québécois a Social Democratic Party, but you have said yourself that it wasn't really a Social Democratic Party in the way that the European Social Democratic Party might be. It was founded upon nationalism and outreach to the working class was mainly populistic. And so there really has never been a left-wing party in Quebec that was solidly founded in movements of the working class. So somewhat of what you might call a rebirth of the Quebec left, if you look at optimistically. On the other hand, if you look at Canada, some of the democracies, it's not much the opposite trajectory. So we see like the NDP progressively moving into third way policies to the point now that Solidaire is basically liberal. So the question is, to what extent are these phenomena related? Is the rebirth, the seeming rebirth of the Quebec left related to the decline of the Canadian left? Is it causal? What is the relation there? And how does this affect the issue of Quebec sovereignty, Quebec nationalism, and solidarity with the left and the rest of Canada? If there even is a left to which one could be in solidarity with the rest of Canada. So just some questions.
Can I just just a quick follow-up, which is I was surprised in your presentation that you didn't talk about the amount of the vote in the last election that went to the NDP from
the federal election.
Right, exactly. Because it, you know, from what I understand, this was to some extent a sea change and the kind of question of what Quebec politics.
It's a whole issue of federal versus provincial politics.
Sure. Do you want me to deal with that right now?
Sure, that'd be great.
I'll deal with the question of the NDP in the last federal election immediately. And out of that, I think we can answer some of the questions that you have. What is very interesting in Quebec, and I think it's quite different from the rest of Canada, is that the rate of voting in provincial election, or what you would call in the state election, is higher than in federal election. In the rest of Canada, as far as I understand, it's the opposite. You have a higher rate of voting, of participating in election during federal elections than you have in provincial elections. So why do you have that difference? I think part of it relates to the fact that for a majority of the population in Quebec, the first level of government that you relate to is your own government, the provincial government. It's a form of expression of a national question. It's a way of saying that if there's part of the state that belongs to us, it's a provincial state, and if we have any hope of eventually attaining independent status, it's that part of the state that we want to grow and develop. Historically, part of the left has rejected any form of participation in federal election, considering that to be a political activity linked to a non-credible, non-legitimate state structure, which is that of the federal government in Canada. So this is just to give you a bit of a quick idea as to how people relate to the federal issue. Now, this has changed quite a bit with the election of a hard-right Conservative Party at the federal level, namely the party of Stephen Harper. Ever since Stephen Harper was elected, came in to a minority status, I think, in 2007, and in 2011 it became a majority government. He has steadily moved to the right at all levels. He has essentially merged, if you want, the financial interest expressed by Toronto, which is more or less Canada's financial center, with the emerging power of the oil industry out of Alberta, tar sands extraction. I mean, the new configuration of dominant class power in Canada is essentially this alliance between the finance or the financial industry in Toronto and the old extraction industry in Alberta, which is different from the previous one, which was finance and industry mostly based in the heart of Canada, which is Ontario. And with this new class alliances, politics have moved to the right in Canada. The reaction to that right-wing move has been extremely strong in Quebec, to the point where a majority of Quebec voters in 8 federal elections voted for the Bloc Québécois. The Bloc Québécois was essentially the Parti Québécois federal. For 8 straight federal elections, the Bloc Québécois had the majority of Quebec votes, and this was a way that Quebec voters expressed the dissatisfaction with Canada. They voted for an openly sovereigntist party in Ottawa, except for the last election in 2010. With the NDP, Canada's Social Democratic Party rose from 1 elected member in Quebec to 59. And that 1 elected member had been elected in a by-election a couple of years before. Why? How did this happen? I think it was, 1, a rejection of the Conservative Party in Ottawa, and a realization that to keep voting for the Bloc Québécois, only Quebec voters who vote for the Bloc Québécois would prevent an overthrow or prevent defeating that Conservative government. So there was sort of a mass move to the new Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party, as a way of multiplying the impact of voters dissatisfied with the Conservative government. There was quite a rational move by the Quebec electorate to vote for a party that had the possibility of displacing the Conservative Party in Ottawa. That was 2. The NDP was very smart, and its late leader, who died since then, Jack Layton, had developed a policy of wooing Quebec from 2001, which was a very active policy. Jack Layton was born in Quebec, moved to Toronto where he became a municipal councillor, but he still spoke French. He understood more or less where the Quebec voter was at and where the Quebec left was at. And as soon as he became leader of the NDP, he systematically met all the social movements in Quebec and all the activists in Quebec. I was in Québec solidaire in one of the groups preceding UFP, Union des Forces Progressistes, or progressive, the Union of Progressive Forces. And we met with Jack Layton maybe 2 or 3 times. He systematically met everybody, extreme left, mainstream left, trade unions, systematically met everybody and said essentially that, look, we have to defeat the right-wing government. I understand Quebec voters. I support your right to self-determination. If we're ever elected, we'll respect Quebec's right to self-determination, and I'll even make sure that officially my party understands and adheres to the right to self-determination. He tried. His party didn't exactly go along, but he at least was able to put in the program of the NDP recognition of the right to self-determination, and also very important in the context of Canada, that a majority vote in Quebec in a referendum for independence would be respected by an NDP government. And why I mention that is because in the late 90s, the Liberal Party that was in power federally adopted what they call the Clarity in Ottawa, which said that the Canadian government would have the right to interpret any vote in Quebec, in a Quebec referendum on independence, as they see fit. They would decide whether the question was put was fair. They would decide even what kind of majority would allow Quebec to become independent. Didn't vote on 50 plus what? It could be 55, 60, 65, 80, 90. They had the absolute right to decide whether the question was clear and what kind of vote would be considered a significant vote for independence. So I mean, this was a direct attack on the right of self-determination, and the NDP's position looked like it was a vindication of the right of self-determination. So I think this combination of 2 factors, one is to defeat the right wing in power at the federal level in Ottawa, and the fact that the NDP under Jack Layton was more open to the right of self-determination swung Quebec voters that way. But that vote is extremely fragile. It's extremely fragile. I've had the occasion to speak with some of the people that were elected, and there's 4 of them, young people that came from the McGill Club of the NDP. And they were elected in areas that they've never campaigned in, have never been seen in before, have not visited since then, and it was just, how should I say, it was a massive rejection by local electors. I'll give you one example. There was one woman by the name of Yorin Lou, who was the vice president of the NDP club at McGill, that was actually put forward as a candidate about 30 or 40 miles out of Montreal. It's an area where GM used to have a factory, and there's a tradition of auto workers being very active. She defeated the Bloc Québécois candidate who had been elected twice in a row, with a majority of 15,000 and 16,000 votes. He was a very well-known union leader in the area. She swept him with 17,000 votes. In other words, between the election in 2008, the Bloc Québécois candidate came in, and Laurent Liu, 32,000 votes in that one area shifted in order for her to be able to do that. And it was funny because I know the candidate quite well, and 2 weeks before the election, he started calling his friend in Liverpool and said, look, there's something bizarre that's happening. This young woman from McGill is running in my area. Nobody knows her, but all the people have been voting for me for 2 elections. Keep voting for her. Every time I knock on the door and I keep saying, look, we don't know who this woman is, it doesn't matter, we love you, but we're going to vote for her because we want to defeat Stephen Harper federally. And she won by 17,000 votes, and she essentially was a worker in one of the elections in Montreal and never set foot in that riding. So you have some amazing events combining like that, which are events that you cannot, I think, reproduce in the next election. Now, how the NDP will fare in the next election, I don't know. But I think this was one of these incredible historical exceptions that have happened, and I don't think it's easily reproduced.
Let's open up for some more questions.
Solidarity with English Canada. I mean, the question was asked.
Well, you want to continue on?
No. If you want to come back on that, I'll listen to your questions and comments.
So one of the questions I have is social democrats have seem to be failed, especially in the country with Obama. Obama's policies are not left. And one of the things I feel like is that the youth and voters voting for Obama will refuse to recognize that fact because, I mean, the only preach hope and the only alternative seems to be despair. How will your party, you know, if there is a kind of rejection of the social democrats, not fall prey to the general despair that will come from that, but actually energize people to
Yes. I think the main issue that we have to deal with is what is quite often called strategic voting. You know, people get to look, we love your party, we think you have a great platform, we think you're doing fantastic work, but we have to vote this guy. We have to vote Bush out of power, we have to vote, you know, Reagan out of power, we have to vote Stephen Harper out of power, and therefore, sorry, but this time my vote is going to an Obama or an NDP or a Clinton or whatever, but I can't vote for the right. I think that's the main issue that we have to fight, and the only way we found, and it's difficult. I mean, we got 6% in the last election, but regularly the polls give us anywhere from 9 to 12. So obviously at election time, we lose anywhere from a third to half of those supporters. In fact, you know, and plus our support is more concentrated in Montreal than outside Montreal. In Montreal, we get about 13% of the vote generally across the city. Outside Montreal, it's around 5 to 6%. So obviously you have problems getting your message outside of the big urban areas, and you have a problem convincing people to keep voting for you when anybody but, you know, the right mover would do. I don't think there's any other way but formulating a program, working in the mass movements, and continuing to push your program. And whenever an Obama or somebody like that screws up, as they always do, is come back on the key issue and say, look, that's why we need an alternative. I don't think there's any other way. I've spoken with people in France, I've spoken with people in Italy, who quite often have the same problem. I've spoken with activists in Greece, who up until the last spate of austerity measures, had the same problem with either the Greek Communist Party or the Greek Social Democratic Party traditionally attracting other voters. I think it's only by continuing to develop a program, work in the mass movement, and try and make the program more relevant to the mass movement.
You've identified one of the things in the Canadian left that I think is really problematic, which is the deep relationship between Labour and the NDP federally, and I guess that the executive as well. My sense is that relationship always results in disappointment and also prevents the Labour movement from really being more progressive than it could be. Federally, I know that I work for the Public Service Alliance in Canada, and we even have a seat. PSAC, and we even have a seat on the NDP Council.
Right.
In Quebec, is the relationship that formalized between the FTQ, which is the equivalent to the SAIC?
Yeah.
So the FTQ would be the equivalent to the Canadian Labour Congress, so the sort of umbrella organization for labour in Quebec. Is that relationship as formalized between the Parti Québécois and the FTQ? Like, is it formalized in the form of seats or whatever? And if not, doesn't that mean there's more room for pushing labour further left?
No, it's not formalized. I mean, the FTQ, or the Quebec Federation of Labour, has been historically close to the Parti Québécois, but has no seats. In other words, it's not the same organic relation between Labour and Social Democratic Party that you have with the NDP or with the Socialist Party in France or historically the Socialist Party in Greece. No, it's not. And that is indeed one of the things that we do. We're continually trying to break Labour away from the Parti Québécois. Now, we've been able to get invited to speak to the Quebec Federation of Labour leadership. Quite often they would call upon the leadership of Quebec to come and explain our position on this or that issue. And quite often they're sympathetic. They back us. Some of their activists actually work with us or even run as candidates. But the problem when elections come, that's when it basically say, look, you've got to be realistic. You have 6%, you have 7%, you get 2 elected, 3 elected. We want to beat this right-wing government, we want to defeat this law, this legislation, that legislation. You don't have a chance. On the other hand, the Parti Québécois can do this. And that's where it becomes difficult. Now that the Parti Québécois is in power, I think the FTQ, again, is getting somewhat disappointed. And the door is open. While we were in Tunisia, I was involved in a workshop done by 2 Quebec unions, which called for labor renewal of trade union movement. And I launched a call. I asked for some form of a discussion between the environmentalist groups and the 2 labor unions to discuss various policies. And the FTQ responded very well, very nicely, very favorably. It was the vice president of the Quebec Federation of Labour was there, and he came up to me after that. He says, "Are you, sincere in proposing?" I said, "Yes, we need a guy." He said, "Okay, come see me after Tunisia. We'll discuss it, whatever." So there's more of an opening than ever, but I'm not sure up to what point it will concretize when the election comes. Same thing at the other level. There's another labour umbrella organization in Quebec, which is called the CSM. And same thing, there's more opening, a more militant positioning expressed by the CSM. But again, I'm not sure it will formalize, it will become formal. We're working very hard on it, but I don't think it will happen very quickly. I think one thing that we have to do is probably rely on younger activists. It's very difficult when you work with the leadership because they can always say, well, my activists, my rank and file, my employee union, my this, my that won't let me. But if you're able to work it from the bottom up, from the rank and file up, I think this is where it changes. And that's one of the issues that we have to deal with. In other words, rather than approaching the PSAC council, simply support us, work with the local unions, with the new up-and-coming activists that get that pressure going this way rather than that way.
little bit to the ideological foundations of some of the different political tendencies that you mentioned, and specifically I want to raise the question of Marxism and how that intersects the Quebec, because, for example, you mentioned that the Parti Québécois was founded in 1968, and I know that was a kind of high watermark for Maoism and Marxism-Leninism on the left, which typically had a stance in favor of national self-determination. So I'm wondering if that was sort of at play at all in terms of why that party with its ideology was founded at that time. And then I'm also wondering about Québec solidaire. If you could speak to the sort of ideologies motivating some of the founders of the party, and were they Marxist, and if so, what kind?
Okay. I'll deal with the second and then I'll come back. Okay. When the party was founded in 2006, as I mentioned, we had people from the various social movements, but we also had older activists and younger activists. Some of the older activists indeed came from, some of them came from the Marxist-Leninist movement of the 70s. François David, which is the president of the party, has been elected to the Quebec legislature in September of 2012, was in one of the Marxist-Leninist groups called In Struggle back in the 70s. Another member of the leadership, François Saillant, I myself, as a founding member of Quebec Solidaire, I was involved in other Marxist-Leninist groups called the Workers' Communist Party in Quebec. So there's a few activists that come from these movements, but not only. There's 6 recognized collectives in Quebec Solidaire. Force Socialiste, the Socialist Left, which is affiliated with Fourth International, which is international movement, I guess you would call, of Trotskyist tendencies mostly in Europe. There is Socialist International, International Socialist, the International Marxist Tendency, there's the Communist Party of Quebec, and there's 2 or 3 other collectives. So there's various trends of Marxism inside Quebec, so they're formalized in collectives. Now, last month, we've just held a meeting of 3 of the collectives, my collective, Mass Critique, International Socialist, and the Socialist Left, and decided to set up a network of eco-socialist activists within Quebec Solidaire and open to activists outside. And I would say this network has a strong Marxist bent, but not yet officially formulated. So, there is a strong Marxist current historically in the Quebec left. It took the form of Marxist-Leninism in the 70s. Since the 70s, there's been some small groups which have continued, but they've remained, I would say, several dozen people, and practically all the tendencies have agreed to work in the form of United Global Front, which has either been the precursor to Quebec Solidaire. Now, very interestingly, there's been no split in Quebec Solidaire since 2006. In fact, there's been no split in the Quebec left since 2001. When we floated this idea of United Political Front, everybody expected splits to happen within 6 months, a year. None have happened. And I think the reason is that all the trends realized up to what point we went through an incredibly barren period from 1989 in the year 2000, and nobody wants to get back to this hellish period. So whether you like it or not, you're kind of forced to work together and develop a mass base and hopefully put your ideas forward and let that mass base more or less decide which ideas are more suited to today's conjuncture. So this is where the various tendencies are. What are we going to see in the future? I think we have to try and analyze where the student activists are ideologically. It's very interesting. Some are anti-authoritarian, convinced anarchists. Some are socialists and moving towards Marxism. We're talking about very young activists, they're between 20 and 22. You know? When they're elected to the leadership of student organization, their mandate is 1 year, 2 years. So what do they do once they finish their mandate? So a lot of these leaders are starting to come and work with us. And it's very interesting because even if they were anti-authoritarian, as they leave the student movement and they realize that organizing is a tough job. You know, people have to work. They deal with people that have kids, they deal with people that they deal with a trade union, with a community organization. Slowly but surely, they begin understanding the importance of having a mass party and are more interested than ever in studying Marxism. Some continue at the master's level, some do it outside. So I think over the next few years, I think we'll see a growing Marxist tendency in the Quebec left. And I think this will intersect more and more with Quebec solidaire over the next 2 to 3 years. At least that's what I see.
Great talk. Great talk.
Thank you.
I have a structural.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
I know you're getting old when they say sir. Sorry, I said I'd like to approach some of Roger's remarks in a more structural way. Because a lot of what a party can do depends upon the type of political system it's in. And the political system in the United States is very different than the political system in Canada. But I'm not just saying difference for different sake. We have a single member, winner-take-all system, which makes it very difficult for a third party to grow. We have a situation in which the kind of pragmatic fall-off that you're talking about is enormous. It's always been. And I think it always will be. To me, the question here is slightly different. And because the third-party formation is 40 years, I don't see that. What I see is that historically, the radical left has had the best possibilities for organizing when a liberal or a Democrat is in power. I think that's just historically true. So that's an important reason to get involved in the electoral process. The second thing is that movements and parties have different functions. When Obama said make me do it, using that apocryphal story from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it's true. I mean, that's where you can see the changes in program development. Those issues where there's not pressure, there's no reason to expect that any party is not going to change. So the issue then is being able to work both inside and outside, one foot in each. The question I have for you guys, given the experience of Occupy Wall Street, that was the matter for us. We saw two things in the States. Number one, a total lack of tradition. I could say this is like the old council system. There was only one factory that was occupied. That was in Oakland. The second thing with Occupy, there's an assumption made that people involved actually knew the tradition of the other. The position I just mentioned comes from Rosa Luxemburg. I mean, that's as old as the hills. Kids in the OWS, some of who were my students, they didn't have any sense of the tradition of what they built. So the two issues: one, how do you organize within a disorganized mess outside? It's not simply infiltrating the party structure, but how do you begin to take yourself seriously about organizing the left here? And number two, in order to do that, how do you begin to talk about deepening a sense of tradition and a knowledge of what actually went on in the past? So that there's not this idea that one's bango creating a utopia with stuff like horizontalism and so on, which is as boring as can be, as old as the hills. Everybody thought it was enough. That's what I see as the challenge that faces us now.
So as Quebec Solidaire sort of grew out of somewhat of a similar alternative globalist view, we'll perhaps address that. If there's any other questions, we can take another one to get everyone in here.
I had a question. I'm not going to take it, so you already went over this on this. In response to, I think, this question, the question about Obama and what to do when people just always end up voting for a conservative candidate who are saying, oh, I would really love to vote for you. I agree with what you're saying, but like, you know, you have to be your response was something about, you know, what you say to those people is you point to your program and you point to the mistakes or missteps of the people that conservative politicians and say, well, look at our program. You know, our program is really what we want. But then at the same time, you also mentioned how your program's kind of always changing in response to whatever the mass movement wants. And I was wondering if you could clarify how exactly that works and why you think that that's successful.
I want to pick up a little bit on what you said and link it to what you mentioned and some other questions were raised before. And it's something which bothered me a little bit when I read all introduction and items dealing with utopian platform is that I don't think the distinction between movements and political parties is quite clear in everything which is put in there. And I think I'm very happy that you raised that. We have a tradition of establishing a distinction between what we call the social left and the political left. And it grew out of our own experience because we had very active mass movements, but no left-wing political parties. But also they move in different ways, they have different function, and I think the relationship of one to the other is changing. And we're probably entering into an era where we have to explore new relationships which have never been explored. And I think what we've seen over the past 10, 15 years is a rise in social movements. I think what we've seen in the Arab Spring, what we've seen in Latin America, what we've seen in Quebec, what we see in Greece, it's a rise of social movements fighting against neoliberalism and austerity, but they do not always get reflected in new political parties rising at the same speed or at the same rate. It has happened partially in Greece, out of the crisis situation they've had for the past couple of years, but sure as hell has not happened in the Arab countries. I think for the first time in Tunisia, when I was there, they finally set up some form of regroupment of the 12 different left-wing political parties they had, and it's called the United Front. It's just been set up over the past few months in order to try and give the left in Tunisia some kind of a coherent voice. So obviously, the expression, the political expression of the mass movements that we've seen for the past few years has been very difficult to ascertain, has been very difficult to clear up. So how can we move from movements to parties? Some people refuse to even make part of Occupy, but also part of the anti-authoritarian left, refuses to make that step and think that political parties are a thing of the past. They're by nature anti-democratic, vanguardist, and therefore not. Some people try and make that move, but it's very difficult to do it within the structure and format of the traditional parties, traditionally social democratic parties or communist parties, and these have become less and less legitimate. I've seen it in Latin America, I've seen it in Bolivia, I've seen it in Venezuela, I've seen it in Ecuador, I've seen it in all the countries where you have what they call the pink tide. You have new forms of political formations arising. New parties, one around Chavez, one around Morales in Bolivia, Japan, Korea, in Ecuador, which are not traditional social democratic parties, not traditional communist parties, some kind of new formations, which are somewhat socialist, elements of anti-capitalist, and difficult to ascertain. But we see new formations developing and attempting to reflect the movement. In Europe, we've seen it partially with Syriza and other forms. And I think I'm going to be very careful here and say I don't think we can export our experience in Quebec, neither to the rest of Canada, nor to the US. I think it's a very difficult issue. I know comrades in English Canada have a tremendous amount of difficulty dealing with the NDP. Same thing in the US with, for example, the Democratic Party and the way the electoral system functioned. I do not argue that all left-wing parties in every country have to participate in elections. I think that's an issue which you can decide tactically in every country. What I do think is you need some form of political expression for the new movement. How that political expression is developed depends on the particular countries, but I think that issue is being put forth more and more. So what I'm trying to say is that when we argue with the voters, when we argue with the masses, they bring up the question of we like your policies, but elections are too serious to squander our vote. Either winner take all on somebody who has no chance. It's a very difficult discussion, but we have to approach it positively by pointing towards the program and party information, the attempt to also reflect where the movements are. For example, as the movements develop and put new demands forward, 4 years ago, the demand for free tuition at university level wasn't that important in Quebec. The movement was not structured as it has become structured, So if you're a political party that tries to be close to social movement, it's obvious that at one point you have to sit down and reflect upon the new situation, upon the new struggles, the new issues which are brought up, and revise in a certain sense your program so this question is put forward and is well understood by your activists. Just to give you an example, right now what's developing strongly in Canada is a fight against the pipelines carrying tar sands. We know that Keystone has been blocked going south. There's a pipeline going west, which is also on Northern Gateway. There's projects for 3 pipelines to be developed going east, passing through Quebec and eventually reaching East Coast ports. I think this is going to be a tremendously important campaign over the next few years. I know environmental movements in Quebec, and I know First Nations, Indigenous communities are mobilizing massively around this. I don't think that issue is reflected in our program as it should be. So now we obviously have to get the Commission on the Environment to look into the issue, formulate proposals, and put them forward at an upcoming party convention. I don't think we're going to be able to do that at the convention in 2 weeks, but I think we can prepare the ground for maybe convention in 1 year to begin reflecting these issues more in the program. But we have to deal with that as quickly as we can, at least in our daily work. If we don't do that, I think we're stuck. We have to have that confidence.
We're running short on time. We're going to give Jeremy the last question. We're going to try to merge this into some closing remarks.
So I'm curious if you could say a little more about the overall strategic orientation of the party, because one thing political parties do is they run for elections of various kinds, but another thing they try to do is try to provide some sort of strategic formulation for broader engagements and thus help tactical expressions be more effective and have a sort of broader sense of what's possible. You mentioned the fact that a lot of Quebec politics is organized around the minoritarian character of the Quebecois and of the cultural particularities of that shows. It seems to me that some of the problems, though, that you're talking about, the problems of neoliberalism, the problems of the declining sovereignty of everyday people over the conditions of their existence, the austerity policies, these are very broad international phenomena that would need more or less majoritarian politics to solve. A majority of people would need to somehow change the conditions of their existence. So I'm curious how the broader strategic orientation of your party towards relating to phenomena which are not, which are much beyond sort of what's going on in Quebec, beyond how a particular minority tries to determine itself, and much more about sort of the direction of our society, the world capitalism.
Yeah. Well, we've tried to link these two issues programmatically when we're when the party was founded, by saying, in our view, both the social project, going beyond capital, and the national project, Quebec Independence, were linked and could not be torn apart, but was part of the same project. And I would say, as of 2008, I think we've begun developing a more concrete application of that. And it's through the call we're putting forward to a constituent assembly. What we're proposing as a strategy is to call a constituent assembly on a very wide representation across Quebec that would have as its goal, as its function, to write up a new constitution and prepare the transition to a different society, both in Quebec, but also one that goes beyond campus. And this constituent assembly would have, one, the function of debating these issues, but also of bringing these debates very widely into the grassroots. We've looked at the experience of Venezuela, we've looked at the experience of Bolivia, we've looked at the experience of Ecuador with constituent assemblies, and we think this is an interesting way of combining these two issues. Because through a constituent assembly, you try and develop not only what your independent country will have in terms of major institution, but also you're trying to develop the blueprint for a new society. And that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to link these two through that project, that proposal of the Constituent Assembly. As a strategy, long term, we see our party evolving and developing in an anti-campus way, questioning the system, strengthening the aspects in our policies which calls for democratic planning, participatory democracy, self-management in the factory, nationalization and socialization of the large industries and finance. And we're hoping, at least the left of the party is hoping, that this is gradually developed and become key item of the program and are integrated somehow in the election campaign. Very difficult to integrate these issues in the election campaign, because election campaigns are run on very immediate issues. So how do you do that is something that we're going to try and work out in the future. So we do have a strategy, but all the means of working it out is still in debate. And this contradictory forces that doesn't make it a particularly easy process. But I think we have no choice but try and muddle our way through that, through these questions. So I don't have a hard and fast answer. Just saying that we're conscious of that and we're trying to find a way to continue linking broad strategic international issues with more national focused issues.
I see that we actually go until 10 hours, so we actually have time for the question. Anybody who hasn't asked one yet? Otherwise, go ahead.
I guess I'm wondering if that strategy you describe in terms of sort of improving conditions of society in one region, one socialism, one region is doing. If that's in line with the sort of larger, as Jeremy was talking about, like the sort of global nature of the problem. Right. Is it desirable insofar as, if we look at examples historically, they seem bound up with certain compromises in politics and world class. And also, is it necessary? Like someone said, that's kind of the last gasp or a sort of desperate way to sort of piggyback on maybe larger sentiments about Quebec nationalism and culture. But some might say, well, it's more necessary to build some politics on another basis that has a more solid foundation. So, I'm sure you get a lot of these types of criticism from the wider left. And how do you address those issues? How do you respond to those sorts of questions?
Well, any attempt to build an independent left in Quebec without taking full account of national questions is failed. I was involved myself in the Marxist-Maoist parties in the 70s. And my party, the one that I was involved with, I was the main spokesperson of that party, the one that I was involved with, supported self-determination for Quebec, but was not in favor of independence and opted for developing new forms of unity within the Canadian Federation. Now, I think that there's one of the problems that hastened the end of the party, because when the Canadian Constitution was repatriated from Great Britain, it wasn't from the UK, was repatriated without Quebec consent, was never put for referendum, and was not signed by any Quebec party. The Quebec legislature has refused to sign on the Canadian Constitution since 1981. And there's not one party in Quebec, even the more right-wing party, that would dare sign on the Canadian Constitution, because that Constitution does not recognize Quebec as a nation and only recognizes a right to French education for French speakers. So in other words, it introduces Quebecers to the level of French speakers and does not recognize the national existence of Quebec. So we're in a situation where if you do not take fully into account the national question, you're suffering. But if you unite with the nationalist parties on a nationalist multi-class basis, you also suffer. So what do? The only way forward, and this is what we've tried with Quebec Solidaire, is to unite the two in a strong bond, which says we do not look at the two-stage solution, first independence, then solidarity. We are looking to go beyond capitalism and set up an independent Quebec at the same time. But for us, and this is one thing which remains to be clarified, that's why it's here, that's why I write things in English, that's why I travel as often as I can outside Quebec. But I think the only way of succeeding has to be within the framework of a large alliance in North America with other progressive forces. So we have to develop strategically long-term alliances with the English Canadian left, with the labor movement in English Canada, but also with progressive movements, progressive currents in the United States. There's no other way. We're 8 million in a continent which is what, 300 million population. So you have to develop forms of alliances. And I think this is something which we're going to try and do more and more in the future. So I think we have to recognize the international aspects of the struggle. We have to recognize the fact that without international alliances we don't move forward. But at the same time, if we don't take care of the national aspects of our struggle, there's not going to be a left hand. Partial answer.
Right, Roger, we have 3-4 minutes left for closing remarks. Maybe you have any thoughts about how you would tie what might be considered a social democratic program and
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is one thing which I hope to put forward in the closing plan, is that one idea or one concept which I got out of reading an MBA French philosopher is what he calls the historic sequences of emancipatory politics. And he says, he thinks that there are 3. And I've played around with that concept and I've readapted. I think we're on the verge of a new sequence of emancipatory politics, which has started more or less around the turn of the century. And we have to learn lessons of the past 2 sequences and understand the new challenges that we face. The first sequence is essentially the 19th century, the formation of the workers' movement, and eventually that ending up with trade unions and social democratic parties being formed in Europe, and the tremendous crisis in the First World War that happened in the international socialist movement. Okay, so the first sequence was the setting up of the movement, the formulation of the critique of capitalism, and of wanting to go beyond capitalism towards a classless society. Okay? That was the first sequence. Movement, classless society, going beyond the system, but eventually failing and crashing to defeat in the First World War. The second sequence started with the Russian Revolution and the rise of communist parties and national liberation struggles. Now, Badiou says that unfortunately, eventually what came to dominate was the form of the party, the Communist Party, and everything was eventually submitted to the interests of the organization, because without the organization, we could not defeat the reaction forces, and where they were organized and succeeded, but eventually coming to power, parties becoming state parties, eventually fell into crisis, we produced elements of capitalism, and we ended up with a bureaucratized class system in Eastern Europe and China, and that ended in crisis more or less around 1976. He thinks we're on the cusp of a new period of emancipatory politics, but where nothing stands. Class analysis does not stand, Marxism is not relevant anymore, we cannot engage with the state. We need an organization, but an organization subtracted from the absolutely abstract. I don't think can move forward on this issue. I prefer a formulation which I've heard from some Marxists in the developing world, namely one called Samir Amin. He thinks that we have to combine in a completely new way the question of movement and parties. Movement and parties have to form united fronts. Parties have to realize that they cannot lead movements, that movements have to be autonomous, but at the same time, movements have to collaborate with parties in order to overthrow the system. So movements have to be open to politics, but not submitted to the party. Parties have to work with movements, but at the same time not try and lead them or submit them to their discipline. Is that a workable program? Is that a workable utopia for the 21st century? I think I'd like to discuss it during the weekend and see where that gets us.
I will look forward to more from Roger. Two panels.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget to, no, you don't know about this. Your name tags are ready, so as you go downstairs again, get your name tags, and also, I think there's a coffee service.
Oh, coffee. What?
Yeah.
That fuels left with me.
Oh, else? Yeah, exactly.